Hello everyone! In this lesson, we will finally learn how to load WordPress content with JavaScript into our page in real time. So, for example, if a visitor opens up the search overlay and searches for biology, down here in this results area, we want to load in any posts or pages or programs or professors that have to do with biology. Now, believe it or not, the first step in learning how to do this has nothing to do with JavaScript in particular. Let me show you what I mean. So right now, for our first step, here's what I want you to do. Up in the address bar, at the very end of the root of our WordPress URL, add on a /wp-json, JSON, right? So just like you would normally say wp-admin to go to the dashboard, instead of that, we're saying wp-json/wp/v2/posts. And then let's press enter. Whoa. So the question is, what in the world are we looking at right here? Now this might look like pure and utter chaos, but believe me when I say that by learning and understanding what we are seeing here, we are going to be able to jump up to the next level in our WordPress developer careers. So what we are looking at right now is completely raw data for the 10 most recent blog posts on our website. And if we go up to the address bar and at the very end of the URL, if we change this from posts to pages and then press enter, well, we are now looking at completely raw data for the 10 most recent pages. But what does that really mean? Well, this text that describes the 10 most recent pages is structured in a very particular way. It's structured using the JSON format, hence why this URL begins with WP-JSON. JSON is an acronym that stands for JavaScript Object Notation, which is just a super popular format for structuring data. Now, this code is not JavaScript in the sense that it's not going to actually do anything or execute any actions. It's only JavaScript in the sense that it's describing an array of objects. Now, if we look at all of this at once, it looks like pure chaos, but if we break it down bit by bit, it's actually super simple. Notice that the first character is an opening square bracket. A square bracket is how you create an array. And remember that an array is just a collection of multiple values separated by commas. So in this case, it's an array of objects where each object is a WordPress page. So the square bracket starts the array, and then this curly bracket is how you begin an object in JavaScript. So for example, maybe this first chunk of code is the About Us page, and then this next chunk of code is the privacy policy page. In order for this to make more sense, I'm actually going to jump into my text editor, and you do not need to type out what I'm about to type out. This is just a quick demo or explanation. So we look at this huge chunk of code, and it looks super intimidating. But really, all that WordPress is doing is it's giving us an array, so square brackets, and an array can contain multiple values separated by commas, right? Something like this. Except instead of simple values for each item, it's an array of objects. Now in JavaScript, an object is just a pair of curly brackets like this. So really, it's just an array separated by commas of objects. Now let me space this out onto different lines so it can really start to make sense. So let me place each object on its own line. And if each one of these objects is a WordPress post or page, we could imagine that maybe in this first object, it would have a property named ID, right? Because every post in WordPress has a numerical ID. And then in JavaScript, within an object, you can just add a comma to add another property. And every post or page in WordPress probably has a title. So maybe this is the About Us page. And every post has a date, right? So then this would have a date of some sort. Right, so this first object is the About Us page, and then maybe the second object has an ID of 4 and a title of privacy policy, and it has a different date. Right, you get the idea. The big picture, the big point is that this is nothing more than an array of objects, and each object is a post or page. Now, if you're anything like me, or just if you're a human being instead of a robot, this way of spacing out the data is a lot easier to read than this, where everything's just completely smushed together. And if we're going to try to work with this WordPress data, it would be nice if we could view it in a way that actually made a little bit of sense. Well, luckily there's this super popular and free tool named Postman. It doesn't cost a penny, so I encourage you to go download it right now. Go ahead and pause this lesson. As of this moment, the official URL is getpostman.com. That domain could change in the future, but if you just Google for Postman program, this should show up as the #1 result. Again, it doesn't cost even a penny, so go ahead and download it. Although I guess before you pause this lesson and download it, you might want to first see what it is and what it does. So if I go back to my WordPress JSON tab, up in the address bar, let me actually go back to the posts URL instead of the pages URL. Okay, so all of this data is smushed together and it's super hard to look at and understand at all. But what I can do up in the address bar is select this URL and copy it into my clipboard. And then I already have the Postman app installed on my computer. So if I jump into Postman, here's that app. In this main text field here, I can just paste in my clipboard, make sure that it's set to a GET request, which it should be by default. And then you can either just press enter on your keyboard or hit the big blue send button. Cool, so now instead of the JSON being all smushed together and impossible to read, the Postman app separates it out, one property per line, and the human eye can actually start to see what's going on. So the first post has an ID of 65. It's got a slug of "We won an award." Here's the link or permalink. Here's the title. Here's the content. You get the idea. Now, I want to say that you do not need to use Postman. It's just a nice optional tool to help you visualize the data that we're working with. Okay, now at this point, the question becomes, how does this JSON data and these URLs that WordPress provides to us, how does this help us with our live search results? Right? If someone opens the overlay and searches for biology, how can we leverage these WordPress JSON URLs to give us what we want? Well, check this out. At the end of this URL, we can add on extra info to tell WordPress what we are looking for. So by default, this is going to give us the 10 most recent posts. But if I only want the 2 most recent posts, at the very end of the URL, I can add on a question mark and say per_page equals 2. And now there's only JSON for 2 posts, or I could set it to 1. Or if I was looking for a specific post and I knew the numerical ID number of the post, I could go to this URL. So wp-json wp-v2 posts, and then add a slash, and then just include the ID. So maybe 7, for example, and that will give me that one specific post. Okay, so the idea is that there's things we can add to the end of this URL to customize what WordPress sends back to us. Now back to the task at hand, we want to power a search. So what we are really interested in is this. Check this out. Let's get rid of the number and the slash. Okay, and right after posts, let's just add question mark, search equals, and then any word or phrase that you want to search for. So I know that I have a blog post named "We won an award." So if I search for award, it returns the blog post, and here we can see the title is "We won an award." Right now might actually be a good time to go create a few new test sample posts, just so we have something to search for. So in my admin dashboard, I'm going to create a new blog post. Maybe I will title this one, "Biology is Cool." Paste in some dummy text. Go ahead and save that. Okay, and then back in our JSON tab, if we just change the URL to search equals, and then instead of award, we could search for biology. And this is the JSON for that post that we just created. Here we can see the title is "Biology is Cool." Now at this point, the gears in our head are really starting to spin. because this search parameter will work perfectly with the live search results that we want to build. However, you might be thinking to yourself, what good does it do us to visit this URL in a browser like this? Right? The visitors of our website won't know to do this, and even if they did, they wouldn't know what to do with this data. Well, that's a fair point, but what if I told you that we can use JavaScript to programmatically send a request to this URL in the background in real time? And then we can use this data however we see fit in our code. So right now, let me show you how that works and how we can get started. So let's begin by jumping into our text editor. And within our JavaScript modules folder, let's jump into search.js. And let's scroll down to our getResults method. Remember, this is the method that will run after the 2000 millisecond gap in between keystrokes. As of this moment, all this method is doing is updating the results div to say, imagine real search results here. Now, this is not what we actually want to do, right? This was just a placeholder. So why don't we go ahead and delete that line of code? And within the getResults method, let's also delete this line that updates the isSpinnerVisible property. Okay, so at this point, our getResults method is completely empty. And at this point, the question becomes, how can we use JavaScript to send out a request to a URL, right? We want to visit this JSON-based WordPress URL. Well, check this out. jQuery makes this very, very easy. So in our method, let's just say $sign to begin using jQuery, and then period to look inside the jQuery object. And jQuery has a method named getJSON. Now within the parentheses, this method takes two arguments. The first argument is the URL that you want to send a request to, and the second argument is a function where you can say what you want to do after that URL responds. In our example, this JSON-based URL responds by sending back all of this data. So let me show you what we can do. Let's just fill in these two arguments. So the URL is simple enough. Let's just go back to our browser and let's just copy this full URL that returns this JSON. Let's copy the URL into our clipboard. And then for this first URL argument, let's get rid of that placeholder and add in quotations and then just paste in our clipboard. For the moment, we can go ahead and leave this hard-coded to search equals biology. We will learn how to actually search for what the user types in a bit later on. For now, let's focus on the function that we want to run after this URL responds with the JSON data. So instead of this placeholder X, you could type in the name of a method or function that you want to run, or we could just create an anonymous function in line right here. And that's actually what I'm going to do. So let's get rid of the X and say function, parentheses, curly brackets, and then just to stay organized in between the curly brackets, why don't we drop down to a new line? And now within the body of this function here, we want to be able to access all of the JSON data that this URL responds with. Now luckily, when this getJSON method fires the callback function, it's going to pass whatever data this URL responds with into the function. So within the parentheses for this function, we just want to be sure to include a parameter so that we're basically giving that data a name so we can reference it later on. Now the name here does not matter. We can make up whatever parameter name we want. So we could call it data or results, or I'm actually going to call it posts. All right, and now within the body of this function, we can use that name, posts, to access all of this JSON data. So just as a test, let's give ourselves a goal. Let's try to create an annoying alert pop-up message just as a test, but let's try to display the title of the WordPress post that this JSON code is describing. So remember that this is really just an array. Now in this case, there's only one object in the array, right? There's only that one blog post named biology is cool, but it's still an array nonetheless. So we can work with this just like any other array in JavaScript. So we gave it a name of posts, and then to look inside an array, remember it's square brackets. In this case, there's only one item in the array, so we want to access the first item. Arrays are 0 based, so if we want to access the first item instead of a 1, we use a 0. Okay, and then let's look inside that object for the title. Now, in situations like this, where I need to find out the name of a property, instead of looking at this squished together pure chaos, this is where I feel like the Postman app is really valuable. So I'm just going to copy this URL into my clipboard, and then in the Postman app, let me paste in that URL and send out a request. So this way I can see the JSON spaced out in a way that makes sense. So I can see that this object has a property named title, and that is really just an object itself that contains a property named rendered. So back in our code, we want to look inside that object for a property named title, and then we want to look inside that for a property named rendered. Okay, at this point, let's go ahead and save this and test it out. So back in our actual website tab, if I open up the search overlay and search for anything, perfect. We see this annoying alert pop-up message. Biology is cool, which is the name of that WordPress post. Okay, now let's take things one step further and actually make the search dynamic. What I mean by that is instead of hard coding this search parameter to always be biology, let's actually search for whatever the user types in here in the text field. So back in our code, at the end of that URL that we are sending a request to, let's delete the hard-coded biology. So it ends in search equals and then the quote ends. And then right after the quote, we can just add on whatever the visitor has typed in into the search field. So we know that we have a property named this.searchField, and we can access whatever the visitor has typed into it by running the val method. So that way our URL is search equals whatever the user types in. Cool, so let's save this and give it a test. So if I search for award, perfect. We see a blog post with a title of "We won an award." But if I actually do search for biology, then the search results are different and we see biology is cool. Now take a moment to give yourself a pat on the back because you just created your first real-time JavaScript application. Now obviously we don't actually want to create these annoying pop-ups, right? Instead we want to display results down here in the results div area. And that's exactly what we're going to learn how to do in the next lesson. We will learn how to generate beautifully formatted HTML based on incoming JSON data. It's going to be a lot of fun. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you then. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we will learn how to generate HTML based on JSON data on the fly. However, before we get into that, I first want to take just a minute or two to congratulate you because since you've completed the previous lesson, you can now say that you've worked with the WordPress REST API. So the question becomes, what in the world does that mean? What is the WordPress REST API? It's a term that we did not hear in the previous lesson because there were already enough buzzwords and phrases floating around and I didn't want to bombard you with yet another one. But now that we're in a new lesson, I want you to know what the WordPress REST API is. The simplest answer is that these different URLs that we've been learning about that return JSON, right? These URLs where at the end of the root of the WordPress URL you add on /wp-json, wp-v2, and then posts or pages or something else. These URLs make up what is known as the WordPress REST API. And the entire point of the REST API is that it makes it possible to work with WordPress data and content outside of the context of the PHP programming language. Because basically every modern programming language today can send HTTP requests to URLs like this, and also every modern programming language can interpret JSON data. Now in our case, in this course, we are using JavaScript, but you could technically create a native Android or iOS application that communicates with a WordPress website through the REST API. Or you could create a Ruby or Python or Node.js app that communicates with WordPress. So the REST API really opens up what's possible with WordPress. because it makes the 4 CRUD operations available from just about anywhere. But what does that mean? What is CRUD? CRUD is an acronym that stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. Now, at this point in the course, we've only learned about the R in CRUD when it comes to the REST API. R stands for Read, which is just another way of saying load. So, for example, in our previous lesson, we learned how to use jQuery to send off a request to this URL, and our goal was to read or load JSON data, right? We wanted to read in information about existing posts. However, believe it or not, the REST API URLs can actually be used to create brand new posts or update existing posts. For example, if you wanted to change the title of an existing post, or we can even use these URLs to delete an existing post. Now, again, in the case of a search, which is what we are currently building, we only need the R in CRUD, right? We only need to read or load in content. But don't worry, a bit later on in the course, we will indeed learn how to create new posts and update or delete existing posts through the REST API. Okay, by the end of this course, we will cover all 4 bases of the CRUD acronym. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. So right now, let's stay focused on building our live search results feature. Now, before we get started and jump into the action for this lesson, I just have one final note for you. So yes, we are going to learn a lot about the REST API throughout this course, but I do want you to be aware of the official WordPress documentation on the REST API. Now, of course, the luxury of the video course that you're watching right now is that you don't need to come to this documentation and study everything, right? My job is to make this easy to understand, but I do want this to be on your radar because this is from the official source, right? This is WordPress.org. This resource contains everything you could ever want to know about the REST API. Okay, now having said all of this, let's jump right back into the action and let's learn how to generate HTML based on the incoming JSON data for our search results. So right now, let's jump into our text editor, and in our theme folder, let's go into the JavaScript modules folder and open up search.js, and let's scroll down to our method that is named getResults. Remember, this is the method we created in the previous lesson that sends out a request to this URL that is powered by the WordPress REST API. And then once this URL or the WordPress server has a chance to respond, then this line of code will run. And remember, just as a test, we were creating an annoying alert pop-up message that looked inside the array of the incoming JSON data and then output the title property. So as of right now, if I open up the overlay and search for biology, we see a pop-up with the title of a post from the search results. But that's not what we actually want. We don't want to create a pop-up. We want to display the results as HTML, right? We want to replace the div with this spinner loader icon to contain the results. So back in our code, let's delete this alert line that creates that pop-up message, and instead let's try to edit the HTML of this results div. You might remember that we have a property that belongs to our object named results div. So we can say this dot results div, and then we can use the jQuery method named HTML to adjust its markup. So just as a test, we could say imagine results here. But before I go ahead and save this, I need to take care of an issue that has to do with the this keyword. Because within the body of this anonymous function, remember if I scroll over to the right, this is the callback function that will run once the URL and server has had a chance to respond. Anyways, within that function, that anonymous function, the this keyword is going to point towards the getJSON method because that's what executed the function. So the question becomes, what can we do so that on this line of code, the this keyword still points towards our main search object? Well, there are 2 main ways of achieving that. The first is to just use bind like we've been doing all along, right? So if I scroll to the right, this anonymous inline function definition begins right here, and it ends down here with this curly bracket. So just like we've done before, right after the mention of a function, we can just say dot bind this. So that's our first option, but let me actually delete this bind this. So I'm just deleting from the period that we just added to the end of the bind this parentheses. So let me put that back in place. And I want to show you a second way of handling this. So if I scroll over to the right, whenever you create an anonymous inline function like this, right, a function that doesn't have a name, we can use an alternative JavaScript syntax, which is commonly called an ES6 arrow function. So let me show you what we can do. Instead of saying function and then parentheses with our parameter, we can delete that and instead just type out the name of a parameter that you want. And then instead of spelling out the word function, we can just say =, greater than, smooshed together to create this symbol. And this is what we call an arrow function. And the nice thing about this is that it does not change the value of the this keyword. So when this code runs, this will still be pointing towards our main object, so we are in business. So if I go ahead and save that, give it a test, if I search for award, perfect. We see imagine results here. So now instead of this placeholder text, let's output the real deal. So when we are modifying the HTML of that div, let's delete this placeholder text. And instead, let's imagine we want to output a heading level 2 that reads general information. And then right after the heading level 2, maybe we would want a bulleted list of the different results. So an unordered list, opening and closing. And then within there, we would have a list item for each post in the results. But right away, you'll notice that writing HTML on one line like this is miserable. When HTML is smooshed together on a single line, it's really hard to look at and work with. Now, in the past, we were forced to do this with JavaScript because there was no easy way of breaking down to a new line. For example, in traditional JavaScript, when you open up a string of text, if I wanted to drop down to a new line maybe after the H2, notice my text editor immediately throws the color red to show me that something's wrong. So in traditional JavaScript, to get around this, at the end of a line, you could add a backslash, and that's okay, right? So then you could just break down a new line whenever you want to. So this is starting to look like normal HTML on different lines, but who wants to go through the trouble of adding a backslash at the end of every line? That's not very convenient. So let me Control-Z to undo. Now, luckily, in modern JavaScript, there's something named a template literal that will solve a lot of our problems. So check this out. Let's completely empty out the parentheses for the HTML method. So let's go back to just this, right? We want to modify the HTML of this div. And now, instead of creating a traditional string of text using single quotes or double quotes, instead of that, let's use a backtick. So this is the key on your keyboard that's directly to the left of the 1 key. And I'm not referring to the 1 key on your number pad, I'm referring towards the left side of your keyboard. So just get a backtick, 2 of them actually, and in between them, we can now do basically whatever we want. So let me show you what I like to do. In between our 2 backticks, I actually like to drop down to a new line. And let me get the indentation to line up. And now that we've created a template literal with the backticks, we can just write good old-fashioned HTML and drop down to new lines without any problems. So let's create a heading level 2 and have it say general information. And then below that, let's create an unordered list. And within that, let's create a list item. And within the list item, let's create a link, right? So you can click on the result. For now, let's just set the href to be a hashtag as a placeholder. And let's close out the link. Okay, and then within the A tag, this is what the user will actually click on. So we can say click me just as a test. And before we save this, why don't we add a few classes to our elements just so CSS styling is in place and things will look nice. So on the heading level 2, I'm going to give it a class of search-overlay __ section title. That will control the color and the font size. And then on the unordered list, let's give that a class of link list and min list. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and test it out. Open up the search and look for biology. Cool, looks good. So now let's just actually use our real JSON data for this result item. So back in the code, instead of this placeholder title of click me, let's use the actual title of the results post. So remember that this anonymous function of ours has a parameter named posts, and this is where we can access all of the incoming JSON data. So back in our click me area, since we are in the middle of a template literal, which was created by our backticks, by default, any text that we type is not going to be evaluated as JavaScript code. It's just going to be output onto the page as plain text. However, if we do want to run a JavaScript expression, right, or access a piece of dynamic data that lives within our posts parameter, all we need to do is this. So if we delete this hard-coded click me, and in its place, let's type out $ and then curly brackets. Now in this context, the $ has nothing to do with jQuery. Within a template literal, the $ in combination with curly brackets is a native part of JavaScript. This combination of characters tells JavaScript that what we are about to include within the curly brackets should be evaluated as real JavaScript code, instead of just plain text or string text like the rest of this. So within this expression, within the curly brackets, we can just say posts to start working with that incoming JSON data. And remember, it's an array, so let's look within the first item in the array. And then we are interested in the title of the post, so .title. And then let me open Postman just to refresh our memory. So for example, if someone searches for biology, this JSON data will be the result. And notice that the title property is an object itself that contains an inner property named rendered. And that's where the title lives. So back in our code, let's look inside the title property for rendered. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and test it out. So if I search for biology, perfect. There we see the title of the resulting post. But if I click on this link, nothing happens. And that's because we did not fill in the href value. So let's do that now. Let's just delete that placeholder hashtag. And then instead of just plain text, we want to evaluate a little bit of JavaScript. So $ curly brackets. Okay, and then let's just look inside our JSON data for the first item in the array. And then in Postman, you'll notice that there's a property named link, and that contains the permalink. So within our code, once we are looking at that first item in the array, let's just say .link, and that will grab the URL property. So let's save that. And now if I search for biology again, there's the link, and if I click on it, it actually takes me to that post. And that's great, but what about search terms that we know will return multiple results? So for example, if I search for lorem, as in lorem ipsum, I have at least 4 or 5 blog posts that contain this word. However, we only see one result item here because our code is hard-coded to only work with the first item in the resulting array. So for example, in Postman, if I perform a search for lorem, in the results, you can see that there are 4 objects, right? 4 blog posts. So let's learn how to write code in the JavaScript of our template literal to loop through an array, right? We want to do something once for each item in the array. Now, before we worry about working with the actual post objects, why don't we do this? So follow along and type this out with me. Right above this line where we are editing the HTML for the div, right above that, let's create a test array. So var for variable, and we could name it whatever, but let's name it test array. And let's set it to an array that just contains red, orange, yellow. Okay, and let's imagine that within our bulleted list, we want to create a list item for each one of these items. So down here, let's actually delete this list item. So now we've just got an empty, unordered list. And let me show you a neat way that we can loop through an array within a template literal. So to begin an expression, we use $ curly brackets. And then let's just type out the name of the array. So the name of the variable is test array. And in JavaScript, every array has access to a method named map. And map can be used to create a new version of the array. Now within the parentheses for map, it wants us to give it a function that it will run once for each item in the array. Now instead of referencing another function, why don't we just create an anonymous inline function right here? And let's actually use the shorthand arrow function syntax. So let's give ourselves a parameter named item. You could choose any parameter name you want. And then the arrow symbol. And then normally you would create curly brackets to create a body of the function, but if you write it all on one line, you don't even need the curly brackets. So for each item in this array, let's just do this. Let's create a template literal within the context of our map method. And we just want to create a list item for each one. And inside the list item, let's use this expression combo, say item. So this would be a list item, and then this would get substituted with the value of red, and then the value of orange and yellow. So with the map method here, we are creating a new version of the array that uses list items. But when the template literal tries to output the array, it's still going to include commas in between each item. So what we can do is right after the map method, so right after this closing parenthesis here, we can say dot join. And in JavaScript, join is how you can convert an array to a simple string. Now within the parentheses, if we said dash or X, that will be placed in between each item. But if we just include a blank quotation, there won't be anything placed in between each item when they get converted to a string. So if we go ahead and save this, perfect. We see a list item for each one of the values in the array. So now all we need to do is forget about this test array of red, orange, and yellow. Let's delete that line. And down here, instead of working with test array, let's delete that and let's work with our posts parameter that contains the JSON search results. Right? So each item in this array is a blog post. So let's do this. Let's output a list item. And within it, let's create a link. Okay, now the text that someone should click on is the title. So let's use an expression. And we can just say item.title.rendered. And then for the href value, we can just create an expression and say item.link. Okay, and if I go ahead and save that and perform a search for lorem, beautiful. We see all of the search results. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. Let's keep it rolling, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we will answer the question, what if a search has 0 results? So for example, if I searched for just a random gibberish phrase that I know won't have any matching content, here's our heading level 2, but as expected, we don't see any actual content down here. However, instead of just an empty area, we'd probably want to take it one step further and output a bit of text that reads, no general information matches that search. So without further ado, let's dive into the action and learn how to accomplish that. So over in our text editor, let's jump into the JavaScript modules folder and open search.js. And let's scroll down to our method named getResults. Here it is. So this is the template literal that we wrote in our previous lesson to generate the resulting HTML. Now, as we can already see back in the browser, if there are no results, then no list items will be generated. So we don't even need to wrap this line in any conditional logic, because if our posts parameter is empty, remember any incoming JSON data will live inside this parameter. If this is empty, then obviously the map method won't have any items inside the array to loop through. So we don't need to worry about this line of code. Let's shift our focus to this opening UL unordered list tag. Let's try to write a bit of conditional logic code so that if there are indeed results, we can output this code. But if there are no results, then not only will we not output this, but instead we can output a paragraph tag that reads, no general information matches that search. So if we want to set up a bit of conditional logic, our first instinct might be to use an if statement. However, in JavaScript, you are not allowed to use if statements within a template literal. Remember, a template literal is created by these backtick symbols here and here, and we did this so that we could break our code up into multiple lines, and also so we can easily mix and match and switch back and forth between plain text and expressions. Okay, but back to the topic at hand. If we are not allowed to use an if statement within a template literal, what can we do? Well, luckily there's a tool in JavaScript named the ternary operator that we can use within a template literal. So check this out. Let's select this opening UL line and let's cut this into our clipboard. And in its place on that line, let's write our first ternary operator. Now, because we are currently within a template literal, we want to begin by creating an expression. So to do that, remember it's $ curly brackets. Now, in some text editors, you need to be careful because watch this. If I type in the $ symbol and then try to enter a curly bracket, notice how I got an opening curly bracket here, but my text editor automatically tried to insert a bogus closing curly bracket right here, 2 lines below where my cursor was. Now that's not what I wanted, and I wanted to point that out to you because if you're not really paying attention, you might miss the fact that your text editor does this. And then hunting down this error can be very frustrating. So I'm going to delete this closing curly bracket down here and say, no thank you, text editor, I do not want that. Okay, and then back up on this line that I was trying to write, now I can just add in the closing curly bracket manually. Okay, so now everything's back to normal. We've got this new empty expression, and now let's write our first ternary operator. So first, the question is, what is a ternary operator? For now, just think of it as a shorthand or shortcut way of writing an if statement, right? It's a very short and compact way of setting up conditional logic. So first, we spell out a condition that we will check to see if it evaluates to true or false, just like we would with a traditional if statement. This isn't the real code, I'm just typing this out as an example. Okay, but right after your condition, then you add in a question mark, and then after that, you write out whatever code you want to run if this evaluates to true, and then right after that, you add a colon, not a semicolon, but a colon, and then you just write out whatever code you want to run if this evaluates to false. So it's very similar to an if statement, right? We're saying if this condition is true, do this, else, otherwise, do this. So for now, the question is, what should our condition be? Well, why don't we just check to see if the incoming JSON data has any items in the array? Let me show you what I mean. So back in the web browser, if I open up a WordPress REST API URL like this, so here's the root of my URL, and then if I add on WP JSON, WP V2, posts, and then if I search for just random gibberish that won't have any results, notice that WordPress only responds with a completely empty array. Whereas on the other hand, if the search actually did have results, we'd see a bunch of JSON data here. So back in our code, all we need to do for the condition is just say, remember our parameter name posts that will contain any JSON data that WordPress responds with, and then in JavaScript, every array has a property named length. And length will tell you how many items live inside the array. So if this is 0, if there are no items in the array, well, the number 0 always evaluates to false. And in just about every programming language in the world, any number larger than 0 evaluates to true. So this is all we need for the condition check. Now let's just spell out what we want to do if it's true or if it's false. So if the condition is true, let's delete the placeholder yay, and instead let's just output a pair of single quotes, and within the quotes we can just paste in our clipboard. Right? We want to output that opening unordered list tag. However, if our condition is false, let's delete this placeholder nay and open up a pair of single quotes, and let's just output an HTML paragraph that reads, no general information matches that search. Okay, now before we save this, let's deal with the closing unordered list tag. So down here, let's just delete this line and sort of do the same thing. So let's open up an expression, within our overall template literal. And let's set up another quick ternary operator, right? A bit of conditional logic. So for the condition, we'll say if our posts array has a length of greater than 0, if that's the case, do something, otherwise do something else. So if that's true, let's just output a closing unordered list. But if it's not true, let's just output nothing. So just an empty pair of quotations. Okay, so let's give this a save and test it out. So if I search for lorem, as in lorem ipsum, I know that should have plenty of results. Perfect, here they are. But if I search for something that doesn't make any sense, we see no general information matches that search. Perfect. And at this point, that means we've answered the main question for this lesson. What if a search has 0 results? Now let's spend the remainder of this lesson making a few miscellaneous improvements to our search. So for example, the first thing that I want to fix is you'll notice that if I try to perform another search after I've already performed one, notice that the loader spinner icon does not immediately reappear. We would expect it to appear the millisecond I push a new key for a new search. So to fix this issue, all we need to do is back in our JavaScript, right after this section of code where we are using the HTML method to modify the results div, so right after the backtick and then the parenthesis and the semicolon, but notice my cursor is still within the getJSON method. Right here, let's just set the isSpinnerVisible property to false, right? Because as soon as this code runs, that will replace or hide the spinner. So let's save this and give it a try. If I search for lorem, here's the results. But now, the millisecond I start searching for something else, we see the loader spinner icon. Perfect. All right, changing gears, the next thing I want to work on is making sure that the REST API URL that we are using to actually perform the search, I want to make sure that this URL is relative instead of absolute. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, this URL is only going to work if I'm using my local preview proxy server that begins with localhost 3000. What if instead I was using my dev domain of fictionaluniversity.dev? Or better yet, what will happen when I try to deploy these files to a real live server with a real .com? Well, the answer is that this URL will fail miserably, right? Because this URL won't really exist in that context. So let me show you what I mean. If I go over to the command line and quit my gulp watch task, so if I press Control-C, my gulp watch task is what was creating this proxy server of localhost 3000. So now, if I go to my browser and try to visit fictionaluniversity.dev, the website loads just fine, but if I try to perform a live search, the loader spinner icon is just going to keep spinning until the end of time. And if I inspect and go into the console, we see an error message, failed to load resource, and the resource that was impossible to load was that REST API URL here. So the question becomes, how can we make the beginning part of this URL flexible so that it works regardless of the current environment? Or so that it works if we want to distribute this theme to many, many websites and users. Now, your first instinct might be to just delete the beginning HTTP root part of the URL, like this, just begin with the / of what you want to add on, and this will indeed work for certain situations and certain websites. However, not all WordPress installations are located at the root of a domain. So this is not very flexible and it won't work for everyone in every situation. So instead, let me show you what I recommend. So right now, within our theme folder, let's jump into the file named functions.php. And let's scroll down to our function named university files. Remember, this is the function where we load CSS and JavaScript files within WordPress. And right now, I just want to add a new line to this function. It doesn't matter where. You could do it at the top of the function or down at the bottom of the function. Just anywhere within this function. Let's say WP _ local localize_script. So this is a WordPress function that will let us output a little bit of JavaScript data into the source, the HTML source of the web page. Within the parentheses, this function takes 3 arguments. So just as a placeholder, let's say 1, 2, 3. Okay, now let's review each one. So for the first argument, we want to include the name or handle of our main JavaScript file. Or I should say the JavaScript file that you are trying to make flexible. So in my case, that's this main JavaScript file named scripts bundled. But the name or handle of this file is this first parameter, right after you call WP onQ script. So the name or handle of the file is main-university.js. Your name might be slightly different. The name doesn't matter. We just want the name to match. So down here within localize script for the first argument, let's type in a matching name. So main-university.js. All right, now for the second argument, we just want to make up a variable name. The name does not matter, so I'm just going to call it maybe university data. Again, the name does not matter, just make up a name. And then for the third argument, we just create an array of data that we want to be available in JavaScript. So let's say array, and remember in PHP, you include parentheses right after the word array to actually create one. And then we just spell out what data we want to live in this array. So I like to drop down to a new line in between the parentheses of array just to stay organized. And now let's just build an associative array. Now just to refresh your PHP memory, an example of an associative array would be cat equals meow. Right? And then you could have a comma and another property, dog equals bark. But obviously that's not what we really want. Now back to the actual task at hand, back in our search.js file, remember our goal is that we want to make the first part of the URL flexible. So back in functions PHP, what I'm going to do within this array is first you get to make up a property name, could be whatever you want, but I'm going to call it root_URL. And then I'm going to set that to equal the results of a WordPress function named getSiteURL. This function will return the URL for the current WordPress installation. Now if I save this, we can test it out by going into our web page and refreshing. And then let's view the HTML source for this page. So in Chrome, you can just right click and choose View Page Source. And if we scroll down all the way to the bottom, here we see a little bit of JavaScript that WordPress is outputting for us. So you can see WordPress created a variable named university data, and it's an object, and it has a property named root URL with a value of exactly what we would expect. Now in about 20 seconds from now, we will learn how to use this value in our JavaScript, but first I want to show you how useful this object is, because you can really build it out to contain as many properties as you want. So back in functions.php, right after this root URL line, we could add a comma, and then since it's an array, we could just create as many other properties as we want. So we could say sky equals blue, and grass equals green. And if I save that and then refresh the view source, you can see we still have this one convenient object or variable, university data, and the different properties just get added onto that object. Sky blue, grass green. Okay, so this is a very, very useful function that we've got here. Now, we don't actually need the sky or grass, so let's delete that. And now let's jump back to our JavaScript file, search.js, and all we need to do to make our URL flexible now is delete this hard-coded beginning root part of the URL. So now we've got a string that begins with /wp-json, and right before this, right before the quotes even, let's just say university data, because this is the name of that variable in our view source, right? var university data. And then it's an object, so to look inside it, we can just say dot root URL. and that will give us this flexible URL value. So back in the JavaScript, university data dot root URL. And then let's just say plus, and then the rest of our URL string here. Okay, so if I go ahead and save this, keep in mind that we do need to rebundle up and compile our JavaScript. So in the command line, instead of running gulp watch, I'm just going to run a one-time gulp scripts. And then back in the browser, if I refresh my fictionaluniversity.dev website, and now if I try to perform a search, perfect. We've successfully made that URL relative. So now our code will work on a live public server, or we could even share this theme with others. And that's going to bring this lesson to a close. Our next lesson is going to be super short and quick. We're just going to make a few minor user experience improvements to our search overlay. But looking ahead beyond that, you might be wondering, how can we search for content that isn't a post? Right? How can we search for other post types? So instead of posts, what about pages, or professors, or campuses, or events? Well, that's exactly what we're going to learn how to do right after our next really quick lesson. Let's keep it rolling, and I will see you then. Hello, everyone. This is going to be a fairly quick lesson. I just want to make a few minor adjustments to our search overlay before we move on and continue to learn more about the REST API. The first change I want to make in this lesson has to do with the starter HTML of our overlay. So I'm referring to just this main overlay div and the actual text input field here. Now at the moment, this HTML lives in our footer.php file. However, now that we know a bit more about JavaScript, I think it would make more sense to move this HTML into our search.js file. It will help us stay organized, and also if someone comes to the website and they have JavaScript disabled, in that case, it doesn't make sense to send them the extra few bytes for this HTML because they will never even see it or be able to open up the overlay in the first place. So long story short, let's jump into our text editor. And in our theme folder, let's jump into footer.php. And if we scroll down to the very bottom, here we see the search overlay div. So why don't we go ahead and move this HTML out of this footer.php file and into our search.js file. So I'm just going to select this entire search overlay div and cut it into my clipboard. Go ahead and save this file. And then let's jump into our JavaScript modules folder and open up search.js. So the question now is, how can we use JavaScript to add that HTML to the very bottom of the page? Right? We want to add it on to the end of the body element. Well, here's how I would do that. I would just create a new method in this search.js file. So I would just scroll down to the very bottom. At the moment, this is the last method I've got listed. So this is the curly bracket for this method, and this is the closing curly bracket for the entire class. So how about in between those, we can just create a brand new method. We can name it whatever we want. Why don't we call it add search HTML, parentheses, curly brackets. And within the body of this method, I would just use jQuery to select the overall body element. And then I would use the jQuery append method. Append is how you can add HTML to the very end of an element. Semicolon at the end here. And then within the parentheses for append, instead of quotes to create a string, instead of quotes, I would use backticks. Because then we can break down to new lines just like regular HTML. So just to stay organized, in between the backticks, I would drop down. And now it's just as simple as pasting in our clipboard. Okay, at this point, this method is good to go, but remember that the code within a function isn't actually executed until you call the function. So now that we've created this method, let's go back up to the very top of this file. And in the constructor function, we need to actually call and run the method. Now in this case, the ordering does matter. So let's call that new method up at the very top of our constructor. So we can just say this dot add search HTML. The reason we need to do this at the very beginning of our constructor is because otherwise these elements that we're looking for here won't even exist yet, right? So for example, this search field property is looking for an element that has an ID of search term. But that element won't even exist in the browser's DOM until this code has had a chance to run. Okay, so at this point we can go ahead and save this file. And if I jump over to the browser and open up the overlay, it still works. And I can still search for biology. And the results still make sense. Perfect. All right, let's change gears. And we actually just saw an example of the next thing I want to change. So for example, if I now search for lorem in terms of lorem ipsum, we saw that the loader spinner icon displays for quite a long time. And that's because I never adjusted it lower from its initial 2000 millisecond value. So let's do that right now. So back in our code, in search.js, if we scroll down to our typing logic method, on this line of code where we are saying this.typingTimer equals, we see that I'm still using a value of 2000 milliseconds, and I think that's a bit too long. So I'm going to change this to 750 milliseconds, right? Just 3/4 of a second. And let's see, I think that should feel a lot better. So now when I search, you can see as soon as I stop typing, it's a much shorter wait, and I think that feels a lot nicer for end users. Okay, let's change gears again. The next thing I want to work on now is when someone opens up the search overlay, I think the text field should be automatically focused, meaning my cursor should already be placed in that field automatically so I can start typing, instead of having to actually manually click onto the text field. So to make that happen, back in our search.js file, let's scroll down to our open overlay method. Right, this is responsible for adding the class that makes the overlay div visible. So as soon as these two lines of code that are responsible for adding classes run, right after those lines, on a new line here, let's just say this dot search field, right? This is a property we created up in the constructor that points towards the text field. And then on that element, we can just use the jQuery method named focus. And that will place the user's cursor within that field and they can immediately begin typing. However, if I go ahead and save this and test it out in the browser, you'll notice that if I open the overlay, the text field is not successfully focused. I'm typing and nothing's happening, and I still have to manually click on to that field. Now, this might not be the case in all web browsers, but for a lot of browsers, including this version of Google Chrome, the text field is not being successfully focused because when this new line of code ran, where we are trying to focus the field, the overlay as a whole was not even visible yet. Because you'll notice that the overlay does not appear or disappear immediately. It takes about 300 milliseconds to fade in and fade out. So back in our code, instead of trying to focus the text field immediately as soon as the open overlay method fires, instead, why don't we wait 301 milliseconds so that CSS transition is complete. Or in other words, let's wait until the web browser actually considers this element visible before we try to focus it. So here's what I would do. Let's cut this new line into our clipboard, this line with the dot focus. And in its place, let's just set up a set timeout. And remember, set timeout takes two arguments. The first is a function that you want to run, and the second argument is how many milliseconds you want to wait before actually running that. So why don't we wait 301 milliseconds? That will be just enough time for that CSS fade in and fade out to be complete. And then instead of the X, let's just create an anonymous function. So function parentheses curly brackets. And then within the curly brackets, you can just paste in your clipboard. Now this code will indeed work, but I want to show you how we can save a bit of extra typing here. Instead of actually spelling out the word function, we can use the ES6 arrow function syntax. So So to do that, we can just delete the word function, but keep the parentheses right after it. So delete function. We don't need any parameters, so we can leave the parentheses empty. But right after the parentheses, we can just say =, greater than, to create an arrow symbol. And then if we're going to write all of the code on a single line like this, we do not need the curly brackets to indicate the body of the function. So since we're on a single line, let's just delete these curly brackets here. And in that case, we also don't need the ending semicolon right here. Okay, so now the code is a bit cleaner. Let's go ahead and save this and test it out. If I click onto the overlay, perfect. You can see the text cursor is already blinking, and I can just immediately start typing. This is especially nice because now if someone uses the S key shortcut to open up the overlay, they don't even need to touch their mouse. They can just immediately begin typing. All right, now let's change gears again, and let's work on the final edit for this lesson. I want to set things up so that if you perform a search and then close the overlay, and then reopened the overlay, I think it would be nice if the text field was emptied out for you so you could just immediately begin searching for something else instead of having to manually select it all and delete it. So to make that happen, back in our code, right before the set timeout line, let's just add a new line of code, and we can just target the search field. So this dot search field, and then let's use jQuery's val, which stands for value. Let's use the val method, and then we can just set it to an empty pair of single quotes. Let's add a semicolon at the end of the line, and then go ahead and save that. So now I can open up the overlay, search for biology. Maybe I'm not happy with the results, so I can close the overlay, keep browsing the site, and then if I open up the overlay again, the field is automatically emptied for me, and I can just perform another search. Perfect. And that's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will learn more about the WordPress REST API. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you then. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we will learn how to work with multiple post types when it comes to the WordPress REST API. So, for example, at the moment, our search overlay only works with a single post type. So for example, I know that I have blog posts named Biology is Cool and We Won an Award. So if I search for either of those titles, Biology or Award, those results obviously come in successfully. But there's more to our website than just blog posts. For example, we have a page named About Us. But if I try to search for About, we won't see any results. Now the reason that this is happening is simple. This is quite literally the way that we programmed our JavaScript. So let me show you what I mean. In our text editor, let's open up our search.js module file. And if we scroll down to our method named getResults, remember this is the URL that we are sending a request to. And towards the end of the URL, we have posts. And then we add on our search string. So this is why at the moment it's only going to search through that one post type, posts. So if we wanted to, we could change this from posts to pages, and then if I save that, now if I try to search for about, we do successfully see the About Us page as a result. But now if I tried to search for a blog post, we'd be out of luck again, right? So if I search for biology, we don't see the Biology is Cool blog post. So that didn't solve anything. Now we've just got the opposite problem. Now we are only searching through pages. So the question is, how can we have our cake and eat it too? How can we search through both posts and pages? Well, the WordPress REST API does not have a native way of doing that. But it's not a problem because we can just send out another request to a second URL. And then we can manually combine and smush together the two resulting sets of incoming JSON data. So let me show you what I mean. Let's set this current URL back to posts instead of pages. And then down here within this code that will not run until the server has had a chance to respond with the JSON data, let's actually cut all of this highlighted code into our clipboard. So let's begin selecting on this line. And let's select all the way down to the is spinner visible false line. Okay, let's cut that into our clipboard. Cool. Now, right now, where my cursor is blinking, any code we type is not going to run until the server has a chance to send back the data. So within this callback area, let's just set up another JSON request, right? Let's send out another request to a URL that uses pages instead of posts. So down on this line, let's just say $sign to use jQuery, and then let's look inside it for the getJSON method, semicolon at the end of that. And remember that getJSON takes two arguments. The first argument is the URL that you want to send a request to, and the second argument is what you want to do once that URL has actually responded. So this is where we would typically create an anonymous function. Why don't we use the ES6 arrow syntax? So first you just type in the name of a parameter you want to use. You can make up whatever parameter name you want, like data or results. But in this context, I'm going to use pages. And then we just say equal greater than to create the arrow symbol. And then right after that, let's just add a pair of curly brackets. And then in between the brackets, I like to drop down just to stay organized. And now within those curly brackets, let's just paste in our clipboard. Okay, now that we've got that pasted in code back in place, let's shift our attention back to this temporary X placeholder that I used. We don't actually want an X here, we want the URL that we want to send a request to. So in order to save a ton of typing, why don't we just copy and paste what we already wrote up on this line? So I'm going to begin selecting at the beginning of this university data, and then just select all the way to the right up until the end of .val parentheses. So right before this comma here. Let's go ahead and copy that. And then down on this line, instead of this placeholder X, let's delete that and paste in our clipboard. And then we can just change this from posts to pages. Now I know that the last few minutes has just been a lot of me telling you what to do without really explaining what's going on. But trust me, in just a few minutes we are going to break things down and analyze everything. And actually check this out. I think after our next step, everything will start to make sense. So what I want to do now is right above this line where we are targeting the HTML of the results div. Right above that, let's add a new line and let's create a new variable. We could name it whatever we want, but I'm going to name it combined results, and let's set it to equal posts. And let me refresh your memory of what posts is in this context. If we scroll to the right, when our first request goes out, all of the JSON data that the server is going to send in response will temporarily live in our parameter here named posts. So back in this brand new line of code, posts is the array of the incoming JSON data. And in JavaScript, every array has access to a method named concat. This stands for concatenation, and this is how we can combine multiple arrays. So we're starting with the posts resulting data, and then we're saying let's add on, and then within these parentheses, let's just say pages, right? Because pages is the name of the parameter where all of the resulting JSON data from this URL will temporarily live. So on this new line of code, altogether, we're creating this brand new variable that basically smushes together the two different sets of incoming results. So now all we need to do is down here within our template literal, when it comes to looping and displaying the results, instead of looking within an array named posts, let's just look inside our new combined array that's named combined results. So let's change this, and if you're using Sublime Text or Atom, you can just highlight the word posts here and then either press Control D or Command D, and that will select the next instance and the next instance, and then you can just say combined results, and that will get added in all three spots here. Cool, so let's go ahead and save this. And now if I search for history, I see our subpage named Our History, and if I search for biology, for that blog post, Biology is Cool, perfect, it's there. And if I search for lorem, as in lorem ipsum, we see just about every page and post in my website, which is what I would expect. So this means that new JavaScript code we just wrote is working properly. However, we can do better. This is not the best way of coding things. What I'm referring to is the way that we nested one getJSON request. We nested this inside another getJSON request. Now this might be the simplest and most obvious setup, but in terms of creating the fastest user experience for our website visitors, this is not the best way of coding things. Now, in order to learn why this is less than ideal and what we can do better instead, we are going to take a quick vocabulary break and learn about two terms, synchronous and asynchronous. Now, in order to explain these two terms, I've come up with an analogy or a diagram. So imagine you're standing in the very center of a grocery store, and you're there with a group of 3 people. So there's yourself and 2 friends or family members. And imagine that there are 3 items spread out across the grocery store that you want to place in your basket. Now the terms synchronous and asynchronous represent the different strategies for getting those items into your basket. So let's walk through both, but let's begin with synchronous. So here's what that would look like. The first person starts walking towards this item, but while that's going on, the other 2 people are completely frozen. They just have to sit and wait and watch until the first person completes their task. Now, once this first person successfully brings an item back to the cart, only then can the second person begin their task. And while that's going on, the third person is still completely frozen and cannot begin anything yet themselves. Right? So then once the second person completes their task, only then can the third person start their business. So clearly this is not the fastest possible way of getting all the items into the basket, right? Because there's a lot of just sitting around and waiting for other people to finish their tasks. But that's how synchronous code works. Now the opposite of this is asynchronous. So in an asynchronous world, all 3 people could be simultaneously walking to get their item in the grocery store. Right? So this person starts walking, this person starts walking, so does this person. Now there's no guarantee or predictability of who's going to finish first, but in this case it doesn't matter. The idea is just that all 3 people are working at the same time. Right? So maybe they all finish very close to one another, and it's clear that this is probably going to be a lot faster than the synchronous way. The 3 people are not just sitting there idle waiting for each other. They can all simultaneously be getting work done. So this means that asynchronous code has the potential to be a lot faster, but it's not always the right tool for the job. It just depends on the situation. Now, having said all of that, let's get back to the task at hand. And that task is us wanting to send out multiple JSON requests to these different URLs. Now, at the moment, we have set things up in a rather synchronous way. Right? Because this inner getJSON request is not even going to begin until this first JSON request has completed. Now there are a lot of different ways we could set this up, but in my opinion, our best bet is to sort of mix and match synchronous with asynchronous. Here's what I mean. Why don't we adjust this so that the 2 getJSON requests can run together at the same time asynchronously? And then only once they both complete do we want to run any of this code. Now that's exactly what we are going to set up together in part 2 of this lesson. So let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next video. Hello everyone. In this video we are going to pick up right where we left off in the previous one. So if you didn't just finish the previous video in the last 30 seconds, you might want to go back and watch the very end of it. Having said that, let's jump right into the action. Here's what I mean. Why don't we adjust this so that the 2 getJSON requests can run together at the same time asynchronously? And then only once they both complete do we want to run any of this code. So right now, let's begin coding this new setup. How about right above this current line, we just add a new line and start fresh. So this way we don't immediately need to delete all of our old code. So right inside the beginning of our getResults method, let's say $sign to use jQuery, and it has a method named when. And then right after that, we can chain on then. Now the way that this works is within the parentheses of when, we can include as many JSON requests as we want, and they will all run asynchronously. They will run together at the same time instead of one waiting for the other, and this will speed things up a bit. Now the beauty of the when method is that it's going to babysit all of these different requests, and it's going to watch and wait for them to all complete before it moves on and calls the then method. So then within the parentheses for then, we just say what we want to do once all of our requests have completed. So right now, let's just start building out the skeleton of what we want to do. So within the parentheses for when, we are going to have 2 JSON requests, and these just get separated by commas. So just as a temporary placeholder, we could say A, comma, B. In reality, each one of these will be a get JSON request. And then within the parentheses for then, this is where we include an anonymous function that we want to run once all of our data is ready. So to create an anonymous function, we just say function parentheses curly brackets. And then you know me, in between the curly brackets, I like to drop down to a new line. And actually, instead of spelling out the word function here, why don't we use an ES6 arrow function, so that way the function doesn't try to hijack the JavaScript keyword this. So to do that, we can just delete the word function here, but keep the parentheses right after it. And right after the parentheses, just include =, greater than. Now the beauty of combining when with then is we can include parameter names within these new empty parentheses. You can make up whatever names you want. Just as a test, you could say 1, 2. And the when then combo is going to automatically map the results of this GET request to this parameter. And it's going to map the results from this GET request to this parameter. And if you had a third request or a fourth request, well, then you could just include matching parameters here. Now again, these names do not matter. It's just as simple as this first item will be matched with this first parameter, the second item with this second parameter. Now again, we're only going to have 2, so let me delete those. So for example, in just a minute from now, we are going to get rid of these placeholders A and B, and we're going to replace them with the actual get JSON requests to the posts and pages URLs. So with that in mind, why don't we change our parameter names here? Instead of 1, we could say posts, and instead of 2, we could say pages. And now the raw JSON data that WordPress sends back will live within these parameter names. And we can access them within the body of our function here. And then we would just want to go ahead and combine these two, and then output them into HTML onto the page. Now we've already done exactly that down here. So why don't we just cut and paste this code into our new section. So I'm going to begin selecting from this line where we create a variable named combined results. And let's select down to the isSpinnerVisible line. So let's just cut that and then paste it right here. And now all we need to do is include real getJSON requests here instead of the placeholder A and B. So instead of A, let's say $.getJSON parentheses. And then let's do the same thing for B. $.getJSON parentheses. And in order to maintain some sanity, I like to break down each one of these onto their own line. So right after the opening when parentheses and right before this $sign here, why don't we just drop down? And then in between the two getJSON requests, we can also drop down. And then after this final getJSON request and its parentheses, we can also drop down again. Okay, now let's just go ahead and fill out the getJSON requests. Now, normally you would want to give the getJSON method at least 2 arguments, right? The first argument is the URL that you want to send a request to, and then the second argument is a function that you want to run once the server responds. However, in this case, since we've got the when method that's babysitting these requests, and it's going to automatically pass on their results as parameters into our then method, since that's the case, we don't even need to provide a callback function for each getJSON request. So we only need to pass them one argument, and that is the URL that we want to send a request to. Now instead of typing out that URL again, let's just go down here and copy and paste it. So I'm going to begin selecting from the beginning of this university data and scroll all the way to the right and include the this search field .val and the parentheses. So just right up before this comma, let's copy that and then back up in our new code. Let's get rid of the X placeholder and paste in our clipboard. And then we can do the same thing for the second getJSON request and just change posts to pages. All right, now before we save this, we just have one more thing we need to take care of. Down on this line of code where we are combining the results. When we first wrote this line of code, we were still using the callback function that the getJSON method supplies. And in that case, the only thing that's going to live in these parameters of posts and pages is the actual WordPress JSON data. However, now that these parameters are coming from the when-then combo, they contain a little bit more than just the WordPress JSON data. They also contain information about the JSON request itself, like whether it succeeded or failed. So down on this line where we are trying to combine posts with pages, instead of just working with the posts parameter itself, let's tack onto it and say square brackets 0. So that way we are only working with the first item in its array. In this case, the first item is the actual JSON data itself. And the other items in the array are the information about whether it succeeded or failed. Okay, so then we can just do the same thing with pages. So right after pages, square brackets 0. Perfect. Now at this point, we can go ahead and delete our old code that we are no longer using. So that begins with the getJSON line and ends with curly bracket, parenthesis, semicolon. So we can delete that and then go ahead and give this a save. And if I try to search for lorem, as in lorem ipsum again, perfect. Everything still works, and now the experience should be a little bit faster for the visitors of the site. Now before we bring this lesson to a close, let's do a tiny bit of error handling. So for example, what if there's a network or internet connection problem, or one of our URLs is slightly misspelled, right? So maybe after WP-JSON, if I add in some gibberish, that's obviously going to throw an error, but we don't want our script to just explode. We want to be able to detect that there's a problem and still output a little bit of text to the user that says, unexpected error, please try again. So to make that happen, here's what we can do. It all has to do with the then method. So here's the opening parentheses for then, and down here is the closing parentheses for then. Now at the moment, our then method only has a single argument, which is this anonymous function. However, we can give it a second argument, which will be used if it detects an error. So down on this line, right after the closing curly bracket, we can just say comma and provide another argument. Let's just give it an anonymous function. So parentheses and then arrow symbol and then curly brackets. And if there's an error, why don't we just target the results div, so this results div, and adjust its HTML. And we can just create a paragraph that says, unexpected error, please try again. Okay, now if I save this and leave in this gibberish in the URL that's going to throw an error, if I try to search, perfect. Unexpected error, please try again. So at the very least, we can rest assured knowing that our script is never going to just outright explode and break down. So let's get rid of that and put it back to the correct URL, and we are in business. We can search to our heart's content. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will learn more about customizing the WordPress REST API. Let's keep it rolling, and I will see you then.